It sounds like satire, but the Nobel Peace Prize has been awarded to a far-right extremist in Venezuela who has been funded for decades by the US government, who has openly advocated for the US military to invade Venezuela to overthrow its government, and who supports war, sanctions that have killed tens of thousands of Venezuelans, and who openly supports Israel's genocide in Gaza. Today, I'll be talking about the reality of María Corina Machado, who is a far-right Venezuelan coup-plotter who has been funded by the US government for decades, and she was just awarded the so-called Nobel Peace Prize. Now, I should point out that the Nobel Peace Prize has been extremely hypocritical for many decades. For instance, the notorious US war criminal Henry Kissinger got a Nobel Peace Prize, and Kissinger was one of the worst war criminals in modern history. Former US President Barack Obama also won a so-called Nobel Peace Prize. And yet Obama bombed multiple countries, including Libya, Yemen, Somalia, Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, and Pakistan. And the Obama administration was responsible for hundreds of thousands of deaths. So obviously this is not the first time that the Norwegian Nobel Committee has been extremely hypocritical. But really, this is just next level. Because as the Norwegian Nobel Committee is giving this prize, María Corina Machado is openly calling for the US military, for Donald Trump, to intervene in Venezuela, to invade Venezuela. But what is especially cynical and revolting about the fact that Machado won the so-called Nobel Peace Prize is that she has been openly supporting Israel as it carries out a genocide against the Palestinian people in Gaza. In January of 2025, she held a meeting with the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Israel, and she said, "We greatly value the support of the government of Israel." In 2024, Machado also expressed her, quote, solidarity with the state of Israel and its people in the face of the direct aggression from the Iranian regime. This is in reference to when Israel attacked Iran first and Iran responded in self-defense. Machado strongly supports Israel and wants to reestablish relations with Israel while it's carrying out genocide. Meanwhile, the current revolutionary government of Venezuela does not have relations with Israel. President Maduro has been a strong supporter of the Palestinian people for all of his political career. And his predecessor, President Hugo Chavez, who started the Bolivarian Revolution in Venezuela, he also broke relations with Israel, and he accused Israel of genocide against the Palestinian people. In fact, in 2018, Machado published a letter to Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who's now wanted by the International Criminal Court for crimes against humanity that he committed in Gaza. But Machado asked Netanyahu for Israel to launch an invasion of Venezuela. She wanted Israel to overthrow Venezuela's president, Maduro. This is the far-right extremist who just won the so-called Nobel Peace Prize, who supports Israel's genocide and asked Israel to invade her country, to overthrow her country's government and president. And by the way, it's not just my opinion that Israel is committing genocide. This was the official conclusion of a United Nations commission led by world experts in international humanitarian law. They investigated and they published a report at the website of the United Nations Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, concluding that Israel is committing genocide against the Palestinian people in Gaza with the full support not only of the US government, but also of Venezuela's far-right US-backed opposition, including people like María Corina Machado. Trump has launched multiple military attacks on Venezuela, killing dozens of Venezuelans without any charges or trial. The US military has repeatedly bombed boats surrounding Venezuela in international waters and claimed without any evidence that supposedly they were traffickers. So the US has been blatantly violating international law and waging war on Venezuela as part of an attempt to overthrow its government. And María Corina Machado has been openly supporting this and calling for Trump to go even further. The Financial Times interviewed Machado, and she admitted that she is working with the U.S. government to overthrow Venezuela's President Nicolás Maduro. This was revealed in an article titled, U.S. Naval Buildup Bolsters Venezuelan Opposition, Leader in Hiding Says. That leader in hiding is the U.S. government-funded Machado. The Financial Times noted that the deployment of U.S. warships to surround Venezuela is part of a movement to bring down President Maduro. The U.S. has deployed its biggest military force in the Caribbean since 1994, when the U.S. attacked Haiti. In this article, Machado openly called for regime change, saying that Maduro's time is over, and the Financial Times wrote, quote, top figures in the Venezuelan opposition say they have been in touch with senior Trump administration officials to discuss how to choreograph Maduro's downfall, end quote. So the Nobel Peace Prize is being used for war. It's being used as a tool in a U.S. government-led operation to violently overthrow Venezuela's government. And there's no secret, we all know that the U.S. government plans to replace Venezuela's constitutional president Maduro with this U.S. puppet, María Corina Machado, who has been funded by the U.S. government for over 20 years. And what does Machado plan to do if the U.S. manages to put this puppet in power? She admitted in another interview with the Financial Times that she wants to privatize Venezuela's enormous oil reserves. This Financial Times article from 2023 noted that Machado is the leader of the most radical wing of the right-wing opposition in Venezuela. She's not a moderate right-winger. She's a far-right extremist. And I'm reading here from the Financial Times, quote, if elected, Machado has planned to privatize PDVSA, the state oil company, end quote. And then Machado herself said, this is a direct quote, we have to privatize and open up the markets, beginning with the energy sector. It will all be open to private investment, end quote. So they're not hiding it. The U.S. is waging war on Venezuela, and they want to put in power this U.S.-funded puppet in order to privatize some of the largest oil reserves on Earth, to sell them off to U.S. corporations. Now, of course, when Trump was president the first time in 2019, he launched a coup attempt in Venezuela. The U.S. appointed the unelected right-wing opposition leader Juan Guaido as the so-called interim president of Venezuela, despite the fact that he never participated in a presidential election. So this had nothing to do with democracy. Now, that coup attempt failed, but in a Republican Party rally in 2023, Trump complained. He said that the U.S. came so close to taking over Venezuela using colonial rhetoric, and he said the U.S. would have controlled Venezuela's oil. Listen here.
Venezuela. How about we're buying oil from Venezuela? When I left, Venezuela was ready to collapse. We would have taken it over. We would have gotten all that oil. It would have been right next door.
So the Norwegian Nobel Committee is literally helping the Trump administration wage war on Venezuela and try to overthrow Venezuela's government in order to privatize its state-owned oil and sell it off to U.S. fossil fuel corporations. In fact, right after the Norwegian Nobel Committee announced that it had given this award to Machado, Trump held a press conference in the White House in which he admitted that Machado called him on the phone to thank the U.S. president for helping her try to overthrow Maduro. And Trump boasted that he has been helping Machado and the far-right opposition in Venezuela. Listen to Trump's remarks here.
The person who actually got the Nobel Prize called me and said, I'm accepting this in honor of you because you really deserved it. That a very nice thing to do. I didn't say then give it to me though. I think she might have. She was very nice, and I've been helping her along the way. They need a lot of help in Venezuela.
Now, this war that the Trump administration is waging on Venezuela is not new. The U.S. has been waging a hybrid war against Venezuela for decades. In fact, in 2002, the George W. Bush administration sponsored a military coup against Venezuela's democratically elected left-wing president, Hugo Chavez. And he was briefly removed from power, but he was so popular that the people of Venezuela filled the streets demanding that he be returned to office. And Chavez, the democratically elected leader, did come back to office, and the US-backed coup failed. By the way, María Corina Machado was part of that coup attempt. It was the first of many coup attempts that she has been involved in. But it's not just Republicans who have been waging war on Venezuela. In 2015, the Democrat Barack Obama signed an executive order declaring a national emergency and declaring that Venezuela was an extraordinary threat to the United States, which is obviously completely absurd. But the reason that Obama did this is to justify imposing more and more sanctions on Venezuela to suffocate the economy. Because for 100 years, Venezuela has been a petrostate like Saudi Arabia. So the US government realized that it could suffocate Venezuela and try to overthrow its revolutionary government by preventing Venezuela from exporting its oil and therefore starving the government of revenue and causing high rates of inflation and an economic crisis, which is exactly what happened. Trump vastly expanded those sanctions that started under Obama. Trump declared a full-on economic embargo at Venezuela. And in 2019, the U.S. Energy Information Administration boasted that Venezuelan crude oil production had fallen to the lowest level since 2003, right after the Bush administration's coup attempt in Venezuela. So the U.S. government was essentially boasting that it had starved Venezuela of over 90% of the revenue that it previously got from oil in an attempt to bring about state collapse, to destroy Venezuela. And during that US-backed coup attempt in 2019, María Corina Machado did an interview with the US government propaganda outlet Voice of America, in which she openly called for a US intervention in Venezuela. She wanted an invasion to overthrow President Maduro. She's been calling for this for years.
Esto no es una dictadura, esto no es un problema de militares venezolanos corruptos, esto es un tema de mafias. Obviamente no van a ceder si no existe una amenaza real, creíble, una amenaza severa y una amenaza inminente. Y esa única amenaza que los hace ceder es la del uso de la fuerza internacional en una coalición humanitaria.
Now, the Nobel Peace Prize is overseen by the Norwegian Nobel Committee, based in Norway. And a member of Norwegian parliament from a left-wing party named Bjørnar Moxnes published a Facebook post criticizing the Norwegian Nobel Committee. Again, this is a member of parliament in the country. He pointed out that the United States is violating international law with military attacks on civilian boats off the coast of Venezuela. He said, "It is a bad idea to give a peace prize to a Venezuelan politician with close ties to Trump who openly supports Trump. Trump has advocated to go to war with Venezuela and exploit the country's oil resources." He added, "The Peace Prize winner has also personally signed a cooperation document with Israel's Likud party, which is mainly responsible for the genocide in Gaza. We therefore believe that the Peace Prize is not in line with the Nobel will." Those were the words of a left-wing Norwegian politician. So I've already shown how the new Nobel Prize laureate advocates for the US military to invade her country. She supports Trump bombing her country and killing her countrymen without charge and trial. She openly supports Israel as it's carrying out genocide against the Palestinian people. And she published an open letter asking Israel to launch a military invasion of Venezuela. So all of that is already insanely hypocritical. But we're just getting started here. Machado has also advocated for years for the U.S. to impose more and more sanctions on Venezuela in violation of international law. And these sanctions have killed tens of thousands or perhaps hundreds of thousands of Venezuelans. In 2017, when Trump imposed very heavy sanctions on Venezuela, she praised them, calling them surgical and effective, with a strong financial, commercial, and political impact, praising the U.S. economic war against her people. Then, in 2018, Machado insisted that, quote, the regime will only leave with force. And she called for, quote, international force, more trials, and sanctions, end quote. Meanwhile, international experts have pointed out that the illegal unilateral U.S. sanctions on Venezuela are responsible for at least tens of thousands of deaths. This was a report published in 2019 by the Center for Economic and Policy Research in Washington, D.C. This study was co-authored by the renowned economists Mark Weisbrot and Jeffrey Sachs. They found that the very harsh sanctions that the Trump administration imposed on Venezuela caused more than 40,000 deaths in just 1 year. From 2017 to 2018, the sanctions reduced the availability of food and medicine and increased disease and mortality. And these economists warned that if the sanctions continued, they will almost certainly result in tens of thousands more avoidable deaths. Now, we're in 2025, nearly a decade later, so it's very likely that hundreds of thousands of Venezuelan civilians have been killed by these illegal U.S. sanctions. In fact, another scientific study published in 2025 in the peer-reviewed journal The Lancet, the world's leading medical journal, this study found that unilateral sanctions, primarily by the U.S., lead to over 500,000 deaths every single year. They estimated an average of 564,000 excess deaths around the world every year caused by unilateral sanctions. The U.S. is responsible for the vast majority of those. And most of the sanctions-related deaths were children under the age of 5. So again, not only has María Corina Machado called for the U.S. military and Israel to invade her country, not only does she support the Trump administration bombing Venezuelan ships and killing Venezuelans without charge or trial, moreover, she supports these murderous sanctions that have killed hundreds of thousands of Venezuelans. And yet she wants more because she wants to collapse Venezuela's economy. She wants the state to collapse completely, to be overthrown, so the U.S. can put this puppet in power. And this is the war criminal, this is the far-right extremist that now just won a Nobel Peace Prize. It is completely absurd. But when you realize how corrupt the Norwegian Nobel Committee is, then it's actually not that surprising that this U.S.-backed coup plotter and war criminal won the award. Because back in 2024, it was the U.S. government, U.S. Congress members, who lobbied for Machado to win the Nobel Prize. And can you guess who wrote this letter that successfully lobbied for the Nobel Prize for Machado? Among the signatories were Marco Rubio, who then served as U.S. Senator. He's now the Secretary of State and the National Security Advisor in the Trump administration, the second most powerful person in the U.S. government after Trump, who has pushed for regime change in Venezuela for decades. Marco Rubio called for a military invasion of Venezuela. Rubio has been lobbying for years for Machado to get the Nobel Peace Prize. Another signatory was Michael Waltz, or Mike Waltz, who was previously Trump's national security advisor. Now he's the U.S. ambassador to the UN. And other senators and members of Congress signed this letter, including Rick Scott, Mario Diaz-Balart, Maria Elvira Salazar, and several other members of Congress. These are the U.S. government officials who have been working closely with the right-wing Venezuelan opposition to try to overthrow Venezuela's government. And again, I have to emphasize that this did not start under Trump, even in Trump's first term. This goes back 2 decades. María Corina Machado has been cultivated and funded by the U.S. government for over 2 decades to become a loyal U.S. puppet to rule Venezuela on behalf of U.S. corporations. In 2005, George W. Bush invited Machado to the White House, and there are photos published by the George W. Bush White House website showing Machado in the Oval Office meeting Bush, and the White House identified her as the executive director of an organization called Sumate, and they claim that this is supposedly an independent democratic civil society group in Venezuela that was established in 2002. Now, let's not forget that 2002 was the year when the George W. Bush administration backed a military coup against Venezuela's democratically elected president, Hugo Chavez. And María Corina Machado was part of that US-sponsored coup attempt. And while the White House claimed that Machado's so-called civil society group was supposedly independent, in reality, it was funded by the US government. This was admitted in a bill that was discussed in the US Congress that was titled Expressing Support for the Work of the National Endowment for Democracy in Venezuela. You can find this on the US government website back in 2004. This bill in Congress pointed out that in 2003, the US government's National Endowment for Democracy, which is a CIA cutout that funds regime change operations around the world, the NED gave a grant to Sumate, which was the organization led by María Corina Machado. This is why I have repeatedly said here that she has literally been funded by the US government for decades. And this bill in Congress pointed out that Sumate assisted Venezuelan citizens to petition the government of Venezuela for a recall referendum on the mandate of President Hugo Chavez. So this was an impeachment attempt. Machado was a key figure in another coup attempt. After the violent coup attempt failed, they tried to impeach Chavez with a referendum. But in 2004, they lost the referendum because Chavez was so popular, the majority of Venezuelans voted in support of Chavez. And later, the Venezuelan government accused Machado of being a CIA agent, and she was prosecuted for being funded by the US government through the National Endowment for Democracy to try to overthrow Venezuela's democratically elected constitutional government. Now, the fact that the National Endowment for Democracy is a front for the CIA was admitted by the Washington Post back in 1991 in a very revealing article titled Innocents Abroad, The New World of Spyless Coups, which was published by David Ignatius, who's a close ally of the CIA. This article revealed that the reason that the National Endowment for Democracy, the NED, was founded in the 1980s under the Reagan administration is because the US wanted to continue CIA operations to destabilize foreign governments, but it wanted to do it overtly as opposed to covertly. It was a change in the imperial strategy. And the co-founder of the NED, Alan Weinstein, said in this interview, quote, "A lot of what we do today was done covertly 25 years ago by the CIA," end quote. This is the organization that has funded Machado and the far-right opposition forces in Venezuela for decades. And in fact, the NED is not even really hiding it. Right after Machado won the so-called Nobel Peace Prize, the NED posted an article about Machado on its website. Right on its homepage, the first thing you see is a big photo of Machado, and the NED congratulated her. This CIA cutout wrote that the NED and Machado have a, quote, shared hope for a free and democratic Venezuela, end quote. And the NED expressed hope that Machado can lead a so-called democratic transition, which is propaganda. What they really mean is they want to impose a U.S. puppet who will privatize Venezuela's oil and sell it off to U.S. corporations, which is what Donald Trump admitted they want to do. This has nothing to do with democracy. And by the way, I should point out that there are some people who claim that Trump falsely ended the NED and that Elon Musk, as part of his DOGE, his Department of Government Efficiency, that supposedly he shut down the NED. It's actually not true. The NED has continued operating, and they pointed out in March 2025, they published on their website that the State Department of Marco Rubio gave funding to the NED. So this organization is now being led by Marco Rubio, who has pushed for regime change in Venezuela for decades. Marco Rubio called for a military invasion of Venezuela. He's now overseeing the NED and another CIA cutout, USAID, the U.S. Agency for International Development. And by the way, in this press release in March, the NED pointed out that it's funding anti-government groups in Cuba, Venezuela, Iran, China, Russia, and elsewhere. So it's obvious that the NED has been cultivating these coup leaders like María Corina Machado and others for decades and continues to do so under Trump and Marco Rubio. So again, what all of this exposes is how extremely corrupt the Nobel Peace Prize is, how this is completely illegitimate. And in fact, if you're a war criminal, if you're a US government-funded coup plotter, you are much more likely to win a so-called Nobel Peace Prize. And I know I already briefly mentioned this earlier, but I need to emphasize that if you look at the history of the Nobel Peace Prize, you can see many war criminals receiving this award. Barack Obama was given the Nobel Peace Prize in 2009. He then went on to bomb Libya, Syria, Iraq, Yemen, Somalia, Afghanistan, and Pakistan. He overthrew the government in Libya in 2011 in a war based on lies. He backed an extremely brutal war in Yemen that was basically genocidal. Hundreds of thousands of Yemenis died in this US-backed Saudi war. Saudi Arabia was using US bombs and US military assistance. And this war started under Obama and was later continued by Trump. Obama also carried out the dirty war on Syria that ultimately led to the overthrow of Syria's government. He continued the military occupation of Afghanistan, which went on for 20 years. This is the guy who won the Nobel Peace Prize. It's a complete joke. In 2016, which was Obama's last year in office, his government dropped over 26,000 bombs, including 12,000 bombs on Syria, 12,000 bombs on Iraq, over 1,000 bombs on Afghanistan. And I haven't even mentioned all of the horrific drone strikes that were carried out, including the Obama administration bombed weddings in Yemen and schools. The fact that he won a Nobel Peace Prize is a complete farce. But again, if you know the history of the Nobel Peace Prize, it's not that surprising considering Henry Kissinger, one of the worst war criminals in modern history, also won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1973 after negotiating a ceasefire in Vietnam, after overseeing the war in Vietnam, in which millions of Vietnamese were killed by the United States in a war of aggression. So he literally had the blood of millions of Vietnamese on his hands, not to mention millions of Bengalis in the Bengali genocide when the US supported Pakistan. Under Nixon and Kissinger, they backed Pakistan in its genocidal war against Bangladesh in the Bangladeshi War of Liberation, and many other crimes in Cambodia and Laos. The Chile coup in 1973, when the CIA overthrew Chile's democratically elected socialist president, Salvador Allende, and installed a far-right military dictator, Augusto Pinochet, that was the work of Kissinger. And yet he won the Nobel Peace Prize, a complete farce. Another clear example is in 1989, the Nobel Peace Prize was given to the Dalai Lama, who was a longtime CIA-backed US government asset. The Associated Press reported in 1998 that the CIA funded the Dalai Lama and Tibetan separatist groups in order to undermine China. I'm reading here an AP Newswire that was published by the New York Times. Quote, "The Dalai Lama's administration acknowledged today that it received $1.7 million a year in the 1960s from the Central Intelligence Agency. The money allocated for the resistance movement was spent on training volunteers and paving for guerrilla operations against the Chinese. The decade-long covert program to support the Tibetan independence movement was part of the CIA's worldwide effort to undermine communist governments, particularly in the Soviet Union and China." So in 1989, the Nobel Peace Prize was given to this CIA asset who was being used by the US government to wage war against the People's Republic of China, to overthrow China's government, to destabilize it. Just like today, in 2025, the Nobel Peace Prize was given to another US government asset, María Corina Machado, who has been funded by the US government for decades to destabilize and overthrow Venezuela's independent government. This is why the renowned political scientist and historian Michael Parenti referred to it as the Nobel Peace Prize for war, because it has always been deeply hypocritical and it has been an instrument used by the US government as part of its foreign policy. Parenti did point out that there have been a small handful of heroes that did deserve the Nobel Peace Prize, like Martin Luther King Jr., like Nelson Mandela, but they are the exception that proves the rule. The vast majority of the time, the Nobel Peace Prize is corrupt, and it is a tool of interventionism that is ironically used to justify more U.S. wars and violence, not peace. On that note, I'm going to conclude. I am Ben Norton. I am the editor-in-chief of Geopolitical Economy Report. Please like and subscribe. Please share this. If you like the work that we do here, you can consider becoming a patron over at patreon.com/geopoliticaleconomy. There's a link in the description below. I want to thank everyone for joining me today. I will see you all next time.